Welcome to the Long Mekong. I'm your host, Dr. Digby James Wren, and today we're going to be talking about Xi Jinping arriving in Vietnam for his three-nation tour of Southeast Asia, so namely Vietnam, Cambodia, and Malaysia. And this, of course, is in the midst of an ongoing trade war, which has not turned out very well for the Americans. Donald Trump, of course, crashed the markets. The dollar going down, markets going down, but they've somewhat recovered in the last week following his 90-day reprieve for most countries, except, of course, for China. And so here we are. Xi Jinping's arrived in Vietnam. And is it a charm offensive? No, not really a charm offensive. I mean, every foreign visitor's tour of a country is a charm offensive, unless it's specifically for crisis management. And so is this crisis management? Is it a crisis? Now, we just remember that in 1997, China came to the rescue in the Asian financial crisis. So that was a crisis. 2008, the global financial crisis. So that was a crisis. So is this the 2025 tariff crisis? And perhaps that's what we're going to look at it as in hindsight. But anyway, let's cut to the chase. Xi Jinping has arrived in Vietnam. Of course, he's leading with the leaders of Communist Party of Vietnam. Of course, they're talking about consolidating ties and trade. Now, Vietnam and China, that's their largest trading partner. But exports for Vietnam, 72% of all exports from Vietnam go to the United States. So that is a huge blow if they have to pay a 46% tariff. Now, Vietnam has had exceptional growth based on, and if you've seen any of my past videos in the last few weeks, you would know about this. So you can just check. I'll give you a link down below in the comments section. And so 46% tariff on Vietnamese exports to the US would just gut the economy, basically. So now Vietnam, which allowed itself to do this because, of course, it's delivering benefits for the country and for the people, but it was always on the premise that it was counterbalancing China, and that was part of the US grand strategy, of course, and that why, of course, the Vietnam War occurred in the first place. But the Vietnamese, were quite smart about this, and they didn't allow this to totally upset their relationship with China, and they are trading with China, but mostly this is in intermediate goods, so enabling them to do their exports to the US. So that also might come under some kind of scrutiny, and that could be extraordinarily damaging for the Vietnamese economy. Now, likewise, this is true for Cambodia, which got the highest tariff of 49%. And that would just also gut the economy of Cambodia. The Cambodians caved pretty quickly, and the Prime Minister Hun Manet sent a letter saying that they were going to drop tariffs 5% of US goods, which, to be honest, there's not that many. It's not the numbers here are not that great, but for a country like Cambodia, it's a massive blow, and some estimates were about 1 million jobs, especially coming out of the garment industry, and that is mostly where women are employed. So a lot of families would lose half of their incomes, or at least half their incomes. And then there's Malaysia, which is just a licensing technology dependency where they were just making, and they didn't own any IP in any of this, and they're just assembling basically, and they were making that transition into actual R&D and even into brands. So that is at threat or under threat as well now. And of course, Malaysia had come out recently in the last few months to say that they were willing to join the BRICS Plus and very keen to do so. Anwar Ibrahim has been very proactive inside ASEAN, and he's worked, as I've said before in my other videos, he's worked very, very closely with Hun Sen, the Senate President, former PM, now Senate President and father of the current PM, Hun Manet. And he's also worked very closely with Thaksin Shinawatra and his daughter, who is now the Prime Minister in Thailand. And that has been to stabilize the Gulf of Thailand, which we all know gives out to the South China Sea, of great interest to the Americans, of course, always trying to create problems there. And then, of course, to stabilize Myanmar. And that has been quite effective, except for the earthquake a couple of weeks ago, which, for Myanmar, that is a major disaster. And Myanmar also was put under a tariff regime, an enormous tariff regime from the US. And I don't see how this can be considered to be, humanitarian or compassionate in any way. But then again, Donald Trump and the two factions that run his cabinet, the neocon faction and the less neocon faction, don't really seem to care too much about that. But when they realized that it was going to destroy the markets if they kept doing it, they quickly flipped and went to the 90-day window for everybody to negotiate. Well, that's the excuse anyway. And let's see what's going to happen. But in the meantime, they didn't do that for China until that was 3 or 4 days ago, when they said, hang on a second, we're going to make an exception. There'll be a 20% tariff, but there's an exception for everything that's imported into the US that's basically made or controlled by US companies. So Apple's the big one in there, because there was all this talk about iPhones being $3,000 in the US. Well, that would just kill Apple. And so this tour that Xi is on is going to make a very big difference, because what he's doing is not really a charm offensive, it's consolidation. They're consolidating the arrangements that they have with ASEAN. It's the biggest trading partner in China, and that is the biggest trading partnership in the world. And it's basically gone from strength to strength, 1997, 2008, and now to 2025 crisis, we'll call it the crisis. Now, the Western point of view, Western media has been talking about that, well, all these goods that are not going to go to America now have to go to somewhere else, so he's going to try and talk the Vietnamese and the Cambodians and the Malaysians and anybody else into buying all these goods. But I think we'll find that many of these goods, and there was a slight change in the law in China recently, just in the last couple of days, to allow goods that were formerly marked for export to be allowed to remain in China and be put into the domestic market, which is only going to intensify domestic competition, which we all know is going to intensify innovation. And innovation at speed and scale is the hallmark of Chinese manufacturing, Chinese market, because as I've been saying all along, the US makes a huge surplus in services globally, everywhere. And this is, I think we're going to zone in on this as of particular interest. And we'll just get to that a little bit later. But so let's have a look what Xi's been doing. Now, ever since the early 90s, China has pursued a policy of good neighborliness. So that is to maintain as good as relations as possible with all of its Asian neighbors, specifically Southeast Asia, but also Japan and Korea and Central Asia. And they've done it very, very successfully. And they've followed up with their words with deeds, providing infrastructure investment, providing an import market for goods. This is where we're going to look. This is what's really going to be happening here, is opening the Chinese economy to even more imports from Vietnam, from Cambodia, from Malaysia. And then if they can successfully do that, of course, I think it will easily follow that Indonesia, which is the biggest and most powerful of all the members in ASEAN, and the key decider in ASEAN, will also follow suit. The Chinese are going to definitely start trading more imports. Food security, and they're going to be doing, that's a big one. Agriculture, I think, is a really big one. And they're going to be doing more investments. So investments into more manufacturing and pushing Chinese technology into Vietnam and into Cambodia and into Malaysia. That's going to be a key part of all the discussions. Also, what's going to be a key point here is not so much security in the terms of the US-China relationship, but security in relation to markets. And so the Belt and Road is going to play a key role here. Xi Jinping is going to be trying to convince the leaders of Vietnam and Malaysia and Cambodia that the 140 countries in the Belt and Road provide the most stable and the surest path for their future growth. And that is that is the largest trading network in the world. And that those countries should be really looking at that much, much more. Now, how is that to be done? That means there has to be more infrastructure. There has to be investments in even making these supply chains even more efficient. And one of the ways to do that, of course, is introducing AI and high-tech manufacturing, digitalization of industry and industrial digitalization. And so we can see that that's already happening. For example, in Cambodia, the electric battery factory finally operating, and that's providing batteries, using lithium from Vietnam to provide batteries to the Vietnamese car market. But also BYD has now announced that they're going to open an assembly factory here in Cambodia. And so we're going to see a wave of vehicle manufacture in these three countries. In Malaysia now, Malaysia had terrible problems with their Proton car. It's never really worked. But I think what we're going to see is that the Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia produce the componentry needed for cars, have access to better IP, better machinery, robotics, AI, 5.5G operating systems for factories and manufacturing, training, vocational training. All of these things are going to be pushed on Xi Jinping's tour. And what that basically does is we're talking about, if you've ever heard of this dual circulation idea, so you've got a domestic circulation of the economy, and inside of that there are economic belts, which are supply chains, if you like, complete supply chains. So from sand to glass in a car, and that is going to be consolidated more. Now, I think there are problems with that. Low education levels in Cambodia, for example, is still problematic, and we need to look at much more vocational training. And the government has not been totally active on this. I think they need to be more proactive. I'm part of that, and like to see some what I call tower universities, which is foreign universities coming in and setting up in using the same campus or campuses, and we're getting 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 universities from all over the world, stacked in with specializations in nursing, in engineering, in technical skills of every kind, hospitality for tourism, etc. But mechanical, digital, IT, you name it, business, accounting, all of those things. There's going to be a big push on that, and China's going to be helping a lot. So I think we're going to see scholarships, a lot of scholarships available for students from these three countries, a lot more exchanges in culture and for education, but also upward for research. And I suppose I'm going to be part of that as well. And so that's an exciting adventure. Consolidating their farming sectors, not putting the farms together, but just enabling farmers. And I was part of this. I worked with Huawei on doing this for lychees. And
a lot of lychees. But these are the best ones I've ever had. If anybody's out there, try and get them now because they're going to go really fast.
You're going to make a perfect online marketer. You know that?
And so this is, getting live streaming, allowing, new technologies, allowing farmers to live stream their products directly to market through platforms like Alibaba or WeChat, or it doesn't matter which one it is, as long as they're being able to go straight to the market, straight to buyers, especially when it's peak season. So the buyers are getting a great product. And of course, with the new logistics in place, they can get their products in days, very, very fresh and at a very good price. And I think that's exciting. And so then consolidating these farmers into trading platforms, agricultural trading platforms for all of their fruits and vegetables and rice and so forth. Now, there are some examples of this. Japan has a rice trading platform set up in Cambodia. I think Malaysia also has a trial program running. Cambodia doesn't really have that going yet, but I'm part of setting up a network to be able to do that. Building a platform for all the farmers in a group, say, for example, for cashew nuts, which is a #2 seller in the world for Cambodia, very high quality nuts, and it's going to allow a futures market, which is going to provide stability for the agricultural sector. And then what needs to be done, and then this is what Xi Jinping is going to be talking about, is opening up the hinterland, electrifying areas where these cashew nuts are found, and do the processing locally. So this is part of sustainable and green BRI and production. And so then you can use the waste product to put it back into the soil or for other things. And very much the IKEA model, moving your factory right to the forest, basically, and then putting all of your waste product back into the forest where it can be. And if it can't be, then it's used for biomass energy for production of power and electricity, or it's used in another way to create other kinds of products. So, for example, the powder and the sawdust and things like that can be packed into and made into boards and other kinds of products. So this kind of processing is where China is very advanced in this, and it can help enormously with Vietnam and Cambodia and Malaysia, and then of course the other ASEAN countries. And I think this is what we're going to see, this kind of cooperation and just value added, lifting up the possibilities for these countries and bringing them up into middle income economies and less reliance on the US. Now, the effects of the US, after 90 days, how much are these countries going to negotiate with the US in relation to their exports? And the answer is they've got to try and offset as fast as they can any damage that this is going to cause. And so this is really the basis of all of these conversations that Xi Jinping is going to be holding. Vietnam, Cambodia, and Malaysia should drop their tariffs on things that are really products and goods that are really important to their economic growth. And that means instead of importing ICE vehicles from the United States, dropping tariffs on that, okay, but then drop tariffs on electric vehicles as well, and on bikes, and make that transition to electric bikes. Although I do see the transition happening, and in Malaysia as well, but this needs to happen faster. And the best way to do that is to start dropping all of the import duties on all of those sorts of things. So electric vehicles, on renewables, on battery packs, all of those things needs to happen as quickly as possible. So at the same time that you drop those import duties and tariffs on US goods, you drop them on all of the other goods as well that are actually going to accelerate the growth in your economy. It can be done in a staged way, and I think that's going to be part of the discussions with Xi Jinping. And it's going to be this is going to be a major move, I think, for at least the next cycle, so 3 to 5 years. It's going to be a very exciting time. And, I've heard some voices in the US talking about war, and I don't think the US can afford to fight any wars whatsoever. It's just not going to happen. This is not the major concern. The major concern is services. And so one of the other top items for discussion with Xi Jinping is going to be about services. How to remove the US services out of the economies that, not totally remove them, but the reliance on Facebook, the reliance on Nvidia, the reliance on Apple and its software and its cloud, the reliance on Amazon. These are services. And so that we're going to have to move away from that. And so direct payment platforms is going to be so important. Cambodia has Bacon, and that has to be integrated better. So now, of course, the situation is that you pay in with a credit card, and then you can use the payment service in the country that you're in. So you can use Alipay or WeChat. It's accepted by merchants in these countries, but you can't use it directly with your yuan or other currencies, and so that's got to change. So in other words, if you're a Chinese tourist and you arrive in Cambodia or in Vietnam, or a Vietnamese tourist and you arrive in Cambodia, you don't need to use your credit card and top up the account and then use it in that country. You just use it like you would normally use it, and the exchange is done directly. So this can be done through the banking system, through the SIPS platform that China has, and other platforms that have been set up by Indonesia and Malaysia and Vietnam. They already have these systems. They just need to make sure that they work in the same system. And this is going to avoid having to use the dollar. And then the other thing, of course, is to have their own platforms for sale. So look, Grab and Alipay, and others, PassApp here in Cambodia. Those are going to be, I think we double down in investment in those, and then all of ASEAN can operate right across ASEAN without any problem for payments, and you don't have to use a credit card, especially Visa or MasterCard. So move away from that. Instead of 3%, 4% charge on all these transactions, you're going to go to much, much cheaper. It's going to be 1% or 2%. That's going to save an enormous amount of money, and that's going to go back into the economy. Now, tourism is going to be huge because tourism provides direct inputs into the economy. I mean, somebody arrives and they spend $1,000. It goes straight into the economy, especially the local economy, restaurants, buses, transport, entertainment. It's into the economy immediately. So tourism is going to be a huge push. And who has the most tourists in the world? And they love to go to Asia. And so Chinese tourists are going to be flooding through Southeast Asia. I think this is clear. I think Australia and New Zealand be very wise to jump on the bandwagon for this one. Same for Japan and Korea. It makes sense. It's going to revitalize their economies almost immediately. Now, we also need to see this happen in education. And I mean also all the RCEP countries, Japan, Korea, all of them need to be thinking about services in education for countries like Vietnam and Cambodia and Malaysia. That is clear as well, and that pumps money into their economies. It improves uplifting their education, as I talked about before, especially vocational training in the first instance, and language training, because so many Vietnamese, so many Cambodians do not speak a second language, and that needs to change. And if they do, if they are well educated, they speak English, and so then they kind of carry all these biases with them, and they tend to just consume English language media and English language everything. And of course, they then start taking on these ideas, cultural hegemony. And so that also it needs to change. And so I think we're going to see a cultural shift, a real social, cultural, educational shift happening in ASEAN towards more openness to its partners inside the bloc and inside RCEP. And this is going to also help save them from the tariff regime that the Americans are introducing. And look, just the clear fact that the Americans are trying to extract as much wealth as they can out of the entire world to pay their debts and to sustain their power. And it's really, I think, at this point turning into almost desperation. I think we can see that it is desperation. And the interviews that have been given by the cabinet, of Trump's cabinet and Treasury Secretary in particular, they just sound desperate and confused. And so I think this is the right time for Xi Jinping to make this tour and to push all of these points and to strengthen all those relationships. And then this is the time when all these countries in ASEAN want it to happen. So it's the right time. The red line is still the Philippines. I've made my views clear about Bongbong Marcos in previous videos. Philippines is the most underperforming economy in ASEAN. And I think at this point there's not much can be done about that, but by shoring up Cambodia, Malaysia and Vietnam and making sure that works properly with Thailand, I think that's going to strengthen the whole bloc. And that's a very, very good step forward. And that, I think, will be the big outcome from Xi Jinping's tour. So all in all, this is an opportunity, certainly for the Chinese, certainly for Cambodia, certainly for Vietnam, and certainly for Malaysia. And look, they all want it to some degree. Vietnam, of course, still is going to try and leverage their position controlling the access to the sea and to the South China Sea. Which was why it was constructed by the British and the Americans and the French in the first place, specifically the French. But also, consolidating the Gulf of Thailand. Ream Naval Base has now finished its upgrade, so I think patrol vessels can act more actively out of there. The deepening of the port in Sihanoukville is almost completed. Sihanoukville is starting to show some life, some new life. It's not just a city of ghost towers any longer. There's more that can be done. I think they need to be more imaginative about how they use these buildings. Some of them don't need to be knocked down. They can just be repurposed. And I've heard some very, very good ideas, for example, in vertical farming and other things like that, but using them for education purposes, just repurposing them. Whether or not the owners and the leaseholders like it. If they're not going to invest to finish these buildings and they're going to stay in that condition, the government needs to act more decisively about that and not worry too much about whether or not a Chinese investor is going to lose a few $1 million out of that. And I think that can be a discussion with Xi Jinping as well. And I think this was all sort of set in motion in the Boao Forum. There was a lot of discussion about how this would happen, and so Xi Jinping is arriving with a clear plan to make this happen, and I think everybody's really keen to help him make that happen. And it's going to consolidate China's position, but China's position is the stabilizer. It stabilizes the entire region and the economies of the region and their security as well. And the Americans are going to be screaming that they need to act and spend more money on military, which is exactly what got them into this mess in the first place. And that's what is also causing the grief with the Philippines economy. And I think Vietnam is now, pretty well going to see that hedging and balancing the way it has is not going to work any longer. They've agreed to the rail connections with China. That's ideal, and that needs to be more rapidly done. All those connections finished. The highway connections need to be finished. The power grid connections need to be finished. And we want to see more renewables happening. All of this is going to be outcomes, the key outcomes from his 1 week tour of those 3 countries. And I suppose we'll come back and have a look at this next week. Thank you for your attention. I'll see you again very soon.